The Kremlin has meticulously and publicly laid out its comprehensive set of expectations for a potential summit between President Vladimir Putin and United States President Donald Trump, transforming what was speculative diplomatic maneuvering into a clear and uncompromising articulation of Moscow's desired end state for the war in Ukraine and the future of European security. In a detailed and widely publicized briefing by the Russian Foreign Ministry, Moscow has outlined a stark, non-negotiable framework for peace that it expects Washington to accept as the basis for any serious negotiation. This framework, presented not as a starting point for discussion but as a declaration of new geopolitical realities, demands complete Ukrainian neutrality, formal recognition of Russian sovereignty over annexed territories, the wholesale lifting of Western sanctions, and the establishment of a new security architecture for Europe that effectively dismantled NATO's eastern flank. The Russian presentation is a maximalist and audacious diplomatic gambit, clearly designed to leverage its recent battlefield successes in the Donbass and the growing unity of the BRICS bloc to force a fundamental reordering of the post-Cold War settlement. It is a direct challenge to the new Trump administration, framing the upcoming talks as a choice between accepting Russia's term for a new sphere of influence or committing to a long and costly global confrontation. The foundational and most crucial element of the Russian framework is the demand for international legal recognition of what it calls the new territorial realities. This is a diplomatic euphemism for the formal ceding to Russia of all Ukrainian territories that Moscow has declared annexed. This includes not only the Crimean Peninsula, which was annexed in 2014, but also the entire oblast of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, large parts of which are still under Ukrainian control. The Kremlin's position is that the status of these territories is irreversible and not subject to negotiation. Russian diplomats have stated that any peace agreement must begin with Kyiv and its Western partners amending their maps and legal frameworks to reflect this new reality. From Moscow's perspective, these regions, which it refers to by the Tsarist-era term Novorossiya, New Russia, are historically Russian lands populated by Russian speakers who have chosen their destiny through referendum, which the West has decried as illegal shams. Moscow's narrative insists that it is not conquering territory but reunifying lands that were unjustly separated from the Russian motherland during the collapse of the Soviet Union. This demand is the highest hurdle for any potential peace deal, as it fundamentally violates the core principle of national sovereignty and territorial integrity that underpin the United Nations Charter. For the Trump administration, accepting this condition would mean formally validating a conquest, a precedent that Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a staunch defender of international law, would find nearly impossible to support. The second pillar of the Kremlin's demand is the complete and permanent neutrality of what remains of the Ukrainian state. This goes far beyond a simple pledge not to join the NATO alliance. The Russian proposal specifies that Ukraine neutrality must be enshrined in its constitution, precluding membership in any military alliance in perpetuity. Furthermore, Moscow demands strict and verifiable limitations on the size and capabilities of the Ukrainian military. The proposed term would cap the number of active duty personnel, restrict the type of offensive weaponry Kyiv could possess, such as long-range missiles and strike aircraft, and explicitly prohibit the stationing of any foreign troops or military base on Ukrainian soil for any reason. In essence, Russia seeks to create a permanently demilitarized and politically neutered buffer state, incapable of ever posing potential threats to Russian security interests. This demand stems from Russia's long-standing and deeply held grievance regarding NATO expansion, which it views as a hostile encroachment on its sphere of influence and a direct threat to its national security. Russian officials frame this demand for neutrality as essential for restoring a stable security balance in Eastern Europe. For the U.S. Department of Defense Under Secretary Peter Hegseth, while the idea of reducing U.S. security burdens in Europe might have some appeal, agreeing to terms that would effectively leave a sovereign nation defenseless would be a difficult proposition to endorse, as it would create a permanent power vacuum that Russia could exploit in the future. The third and equally critical Russian condition is the comprehensive and unconditional lifting of all Western sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014. The Kremlin's list is exhaustive. demanding not just the termination of economic sanctions against its banking, energy, and defensive sector, but also the removal of all technology transfer restrictions that have hampered its industrial and military modernization. Furthermore, Moscow is demanding the reversal of personal sanctions against hundreds of Russian officials and business leaders, the unfreezing of all Russian state assets held in Western financial institutions, including the hundreds of billions of dollars from its central bank reserves, and the restoration of its access to the SWIFT international payment system. While Russia has managed to weather the sanctions regime partly through import substitution, reorienting trade towards Asia and developing alternative financial systems like the BRICS, a platform, the economic cost has been substantial. The Kremlin sees the lifting of sanctions as essential for its long-term economic development and for its ability to project power globally. This demand places U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in an extremely difficult position. Releasing frozen Russian assets and dismantling the complex web of sanctions would be seen by many in Congress as a reward for aggression and would face immense political and legal challenges. It would also remove the most powerful leverage the West holds over Moscow. Russia is essentially demanding to be paid for ending a war it started. The final and most ambitious component of the Russian framework is a call for negotiations on a new, legally binding security treaty for Europe. This is a revival and expansion of the draft treaties Russia presented to the US and NATO in late 2021, just before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Russian proposal calls for a formal end to NATO's open-door policy, effectively giving Moscow a veto over any future expansions of the alliance. It also demands the rollback of NATO military infrastructure from all countries that joined the alliance after 1997. This would mean the removal of NATO forces, bases, and advanced weaponry from 14 member states, including Poland, Romania, and the Baltic nations. The Kremlin argues that this is necessary to restore the military balance that existed at the end of the Cold War and to implement the principle of indivisible security, the idea that no nation can strengthen its security at the expense of others. In reality, this would create a two-tiered NATO, with the security of its eastern members significantly downgraded. This demand is a direct assault on the sovereignty of Eastern European nations and the credibility of the entire NATO alliance. It is perhaps the most ideologically challenging demand for Washington. Secretary of State Rubio would view this as a Russian attempt to achieve its primary strategic goal: the effective dissolution of NATO as a cohesive military alliance and the reestablishment of a Russian sphere of dominance over Eastern Europe. It would be a complete reversal of 30 years of US and European policy. Moscow's decision to publicly detail these demands before any summit has taken place is a calculated move. It is designed to frame the narrative, manage expectations, and place the onus on President Trump to either accept these terms as a basis for discussion or be cast as a spoiler of peace. The Kremlin is playing on what it perceives to be President Trump's transactional nature and his America First instinct. Russian analysts believe Trump is a deal maker who is less interested in the ideological underpinning of the liberal international order and more focused on cutting what he sees as bad deals for the United States. The Russian pitch is implicitly tailored to him. Why should America continue to pay billions to defend Ukraine and police Europe when you can have peace and stability by simply acknowledging the reality on the ground and focusing on your own problem? Moscow is betting that Trump may be tempted by the prospect of a grand bargain that would allow him to declare a major foreign policy victory and a costly war and pivot America's focus away from Europe. They believe he is more susceptible to arguments about burden sharing and sphere of influence than his predecessors. The reaction within the Trump administration is likely to be sharply divided, reflecting the ongoing struggle for the soul of its foreign policy. The State Department, led by Secretary Rubio, would almost certainly recommend rejecting the Russian framework out of hand. Rubio and his team of diplomats would argue that accepting any of these terms would be a catastrophic betrayal of allies, by violations of international law, and a green light for further aggression by Russia and other autocratic states. They would warn that it would shatter NATO's credibility and creates a far more dangerous and unstable world for the United States. They would advise the president that this is not a serious offer but a demand for surrender, designed to humiliate the West. Conversely, the more nationalist and realist camp, with its intellectual center in parts of the Pentagon under Secretary Hexed, and among certain White House advisors might see some elements as a distasteful but realistic starting point. While they would not endorse the full framework, they might be more open to discussing concepts like Ukrainian neutrality and a revised European security map if it meant a significant reduction in America's military and financial commitment to the continent. They could argue that the United States can no longer afford to be the world's policeman and that a stable, if unjust, balance of power in Europe is preferable to an endless war that drains American resources needed to confront China. The Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, might adopt a different angle, emphasizing the imperative of direct dialogue to prevent miscalculation and escalation, potentially seeing a summit as a necessary channel to de-escalate tensions regardless of the maximalist opening demands. The Kremlin is also negotiating from what it perceives to be a position of unprecedented strength. The recent collapse of the Ukrainian front at Pokrovsk has convinced Moscow that it has military dominance and that time is on its side. Furthermore, the formal unification of the expanded BRICS bloc provided Russia with a powerful diplomatic and economic shield. Having successfully created the scaffolding of an alternative financial and political system with China, India, and other major powers, Russia feels less isolated and less dependent on the West than at any point since the invasion began. This gives Putin significant leverage. He can present his terms to Trump as a final offer with the implicit message that if the West is not interested, Russia will simply continue its military campaign and consolidate its gain while pivoting its entire economy and foreign policy eastward toward its BRICS partner. The existence of this viable Plan B fundamentally changes the dynamic of any potential negotiations. In conclusion, the Kremlin's detailed expectations for a Putin-Trump summit are not merely a wish list. They are a stark and comprehensive vision for a new European and global order dictated on Russian terms. By demanding recognition of annexed lands, the neutralization of Ukraine, the removal of all sanctions, and the rollback of NATO, Moscow has thrown down the gauntlet. It has defined what victory looks like and has challenged President Trump to be the American leader who formally accepts it. This Russian framework is designed to exploit internal divisions in the West and to appeal to President Trump's personal style of deal-making. The coming weeks will be a period of intense and high-stakes deliberations within the Trump's administrations. The decisions of whether to engage with this framework and on what terms will be one of the most consequential foreign policy choice of the 21st century. It will determine the fate of Ukraine, the future of NATO alliance, and the shape of the global balance of power for generations to come. The world now waits to see if President Trump will see a potential deal where his predecessors saw only a demand for capitulation. Many of my listeners, like 70%, haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel. And so many of you don't even know that you haven't subscribed. That is actually what makes the show going. It's almost like you're making a donation to the show. So that's why I ask again and again, because it enables us to grow and grow and grow. And we're going for the long haul here. And listen, if this is your first time listening to World Global Conflict, you don't have to subscribe. You guys, you're first ones on me. But if you have watched this show before, it's like you're a freeloader now. So all I would ask you is, if you have seen this show before and you like it, help me, help my team here. Hit that subscribe and like button now, and we will continue to build this show for you. That I swear. Thank you to all of you guys who have subscribed. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. That's all for me for today. I will see you soon. Bye for now.